Well, LSU basketball starts their SEC tournament play today against Missouri after they defeated Ole Miss last night. Plus, if Jayden Daniels does get the starting quarterback job, where does he stand among other quarterbacks in the SEC? We'll break all of that down. Plus, we're going to be doing Mailbag Wednesday on a Thursday since we weren't able to get to it yesterday. So we'll get to your questions as well. All of that and more. Locked on LSU.
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. I'm Caroline Fenton, and I am your host, as I am every day. You can follow me on Twitter at CarolineFenton1. I'm a radio host here in Nashville, Tennessee for ESPN 1025 The Game. I'm the afternoon radio host. So I tweet all things sports, all things NFL, all things college football, and of course, all things LSU as well. But I also have our Locked on LSU Twitter page at Locked on LSU. You can follow along for that for podcast updates. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, Locked on LSU, so you'll get notified as soon as those podcast videos drop. You can find the podcast anywhere, Apple Podcast, Spotify, wherever you prefer to listen to your podcast, you can find us Locked on LSU. Now, SEC tournament play kicked off on Wednesday night. So we had Missouri and Ole Miss earlier on Wednesday. Missouri beating Ole Miss 72-60, and later on in the day, Vanderbilt just stomping on the 14 seed Georgia 86-51. So LSU will take on the 12 seed Missouri tomorrow afternoon at 1:30. We've also got Texas A&M Florida tomorrow morning at 11 Central Time, of course. Mississippi State, South Carolina, 5 o'clock. Vanderbilt, Alabama tomorrow at 7:30. It's actually going to be a pretty interesting game, and I will make all of my betting picks later on in the podcast. But I want to focus on LSU, Missouri, because that's why we are all here. Now, I really was kind of hoping that that Missouri would beat Ole Miss. Now, both of these teams are going into the SEC tournament on a little bit of a downward slope. They each had lost a handful of games going into the SEC tournament. So it's kind of a tough game to pick because I always like to pick the hot team. Whatever team's coming in to the game with a big win, whatever team is coming into the game on a win streak. But I look at the regular season. And I saw what LSU did to Missouri. 20-point win in the regular season versus Ole Miss that was seeming to give LSU some problems. And I don't necessarily know how much of those games and those outcomes, at least in the regular season, were due to issues that their opponents was giving LSU, whether that was Ole Miss just knew how to stop that offense, just knew how to stop those threes, or if it was just LSU coming in on an off night, or if it was LSU coming in against Missouri and having an on night. Because I think what we've seen from this LSU basketball team is they're pretty hard to predict. What we've seen from this LSU basketball team is 1 week they can come in and just absolutely clobber Kentucky and then turn around a couple weeks later and lose to Vanderbilt and Ole Miss at the lower echelon of the SEC. So I don't know how much of it I can attribute to opponent versus LSU just coming in on an off night, LSU just, not sticking to their assignments, LSU just not having a good shooting night. But if I were to pick an outcome of the Ole Miss-Missouri game, I would have picked Missouri. And I think that this gives LSU at least a more opportune matchup because they beat this team before. They're going into this game knowing that, hey, we beat this team. And we didn't just beat this team. We clobbered this team in the regular season. And I think LSU's also coming into this game knowing, we just had a really great game. We just had a barn burner game against one of the better teams in the SEC in Arkansas. So they're going into this game against Missouri saying, on the other side, we get a rematch against Arkansas, and we get to prove ourselves against some of the better teams in the SEC if we can make it past Missouri, which they've done before, which shouldn't be a difficult task for LSU. But I look at Missouri's team, and I don't think it's very hard to figure out. Missouri is 12-2 whenever they out-rebound their opponents. Now, against Ole Miss, they had 3 players finish with 5 or more rebounds. They had 3 players finish with 5 or more rebounds. And I look at this LSU defense, and that is absolutely something that they can shut down because Missouri finds their best success when they continue to keep the ball in their possession. I look at some of LSU's greatest strengths, and that's exactly what they're best at, is defense and keeping the ball out of the other team's hands. If they can continue to do that, and if they can continue to make shots, and I've even seen like LSU doesn't need to necessarily sink every single 3 in order to win games, as long as their defense does what it can do, as long as the shooting stays consistent, and as long as they can make free throws. I think that's the key to success here. I think that's the key to success against Missouri, and I think that's the key to success against Arkansas. You got to make your free throws and stay disciplined. That's another thing that's just plagued LSU in so many games in the past, is they're committing so many penalties. They're committing so many fouls. Keep the ball out of their hands and play very physical defense up around the net to make sure that that ball does not fall in Missouri's hands, because that's when they find their most success. But coming up next, Jayden Daniels, a new transfer quarterback coming into LSU. And I promise y'all, it's not going to be the Jayden Daniels show every single podcast, but this is a big week. I mean, this is the first week Jayden Daniels transfers in, so I promise not every single show will be about Jayden Daniels, but it's the talk of the town. It is the talk of the town surrounding LSU football fans. So coming up next, if Jayden Daniels does win the starting quarterback job, which is incredibly presumptuous of me to say, because he hasn't won any sort of job, and this very much so will be a quarterback competition. But in a fantasy land, fast forward a few months, Jayden Daniels has the starting job. Where does he rank up against the other quarterbacks in the SEC? While there is a lot of question around some of the quarterbacks coming in, whether they're guys who've sat on the bench in the past who now have the starting job, whether it's transfers, some question marks surrounding players in the SEC. But where does Jayden Daniels stack up against other quarterbacks? What we know. We'll get into that coming up. But before we do that, I got to tell you all about Stat Hero. So around the time of month is when everyone is sending out their bracket. It's whenever you're, picking your favorites to win. It's whenever you're trying to predict the upsets. But this year, I don't want to just throw my money away like I seem to do every single year with my brackets. This year, I'm hedging my bets with Stat Hero's NCAA Pick'em contest. So these pit the star players against each other in an amazing hybrid between fantasy and sports gambling. Take control back from those handicappers that always seem to have the advantage. Start focusing on the players you know best with a gameplay that doesn't rely on big spreads, long odds, or funky props, because I know how much that can really cripple some people. So just stick to the easy stuff. Stat Hero gives you the advantage, resulting in their gamers winning 4 times more often. Why? Because Stat Hero eliminates the mystery about what you're going up against. You know exactly what you're going into. In addition to their pick'em games, they also have dozens of lineups that you can comb through to take on head-to-head. They simply post sets of players for you to take on with a set of players you choose. It is the easiest and fastest way to get your sports action fix. The simple, sleek gameplay will have you playing in minutes. This is what daily fantasy was meant to be. So this week, I'm picking all SEC tournament players. I picked Scottie Pippen throughout the week, and after that game on Wednesday night against Georgia, I think that I did myself some favors there. So I picked Scottie Pippen, but going into this SEC tournament week, I am going to side with Oscar Tshiebwe. I mean, he has been lights out for Kentucky so far this season. I think Kentucky is a pretty veteran team that will be able to make it pretty far in the tournament. So whenever the day comes that Kentucky does play their SEC tournament game, I am siding with Oscar Tshiebwe. So sign up for free right now at stathero.com/lockedon and use promo code LOCKEDON for a 100% deposit match. That's stathero.com/lockedon. Use promo code LOCKEDON for a 100% match. stathero.com/lockedon, promo code LOCKEDON. Terms and conditions apply. Thanks again for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. Make sure to check out Locked On Bracket Breakdown March 14th right here on the Locked On LSU podcast feed and YouTube channel. College basketball experts Chris Gordy, Andy Patton, and betting expert Lee Sterling give you in-depth breakdowns on every matchup. Now, there are some question marks for some SEC quarterbacks, But knowing what we know now, how would Jayden Daniels stack up against other quarterbacks in the league? And I think it's a pretty interesting question to bring up because it's assuming that Jayden Daniels is going to win the starting job. Now, we don't know that for certain. We can probably assume that it's either going to be Myles Brennan or Jayden Daniels, but nothing is for certain yet. But since we don't know much about Jayden Daniels, since Myles Brennan feels a little bit more like a constant, how would Jayden Daniels stack up against the rest of the SEC? I think it's a legitimate question, seeing as though that's a legitimate thing that might happen. Now, I hopped on Locked On Sun Devils, so make sure to check out their most recent episode talking to them about our expectations for Jayden Daniels and our reaction, at least my reaction, to Jayden Daniels transferring to LSU. And I kind of asked their perception of Jayden Daniels, and it was incredibly 50-50. And that's what the Locked On Sun Devils hosts were saying, was the fan base feels incredibly 50-50 about Jayden Daniels. Half of them feel like he's a really incredibly talented quarterback, as we saw in his first season at Arizona State. He's a talented quarterback, and Arizona State just didn't provide him enough weapons. That Arizona State just didn't capitalize off of his talent. And the other half says, I mean, he is what he is. He's the type of quarterback that he doesn't elevate the players around him. And I think that all of those things can kind of be valid. But if Jayden Daniels is the starting quarterback for the LSU Tigers, how does he stack up against the rest? Now, I said there are some question marks for some teams, but you look at what we probably know the most of. Bryce Young at Alabama, the reigning Heisman Trophy winner. I think we feel pretty certain that Bryce Young is most likely in that top tier of SEC quarterbacks. I think Bryce Young is probably in the top tier of college quarterbacks. I don't know much about Jayden Daniels. All I know is the highlights that I've seen and the stats and the box scores that I've studied and the Arizona State friends at Locked on Sun Devils and getting their perception of Jayden Daniels. But we don't really know, even what he's been in the past, we don't really know what he would be like in this LSU team. But from what we do know, I'm not sure if he would be on the same tier as Bryce Young. Other quarterbacks that we feel pretty certain we have a large enough sample size, whether they've started for a season or a couple seasons, or we've seen enough starts from them to kind of get a good vibe for them. KJ Jefferson is one at Arkansas, Hendon Hooker at Tennessee, Will Rogers at Mississippi State, Anthony Richardson, and Stetson Bennett. We all know about those quarterbacks. Will Levis at Kentucky. We know about them. TJ Finley at Auburn. Also, the Auburn quarterback situation, the Auburn football situation is, I don't know the right word to, delicate. It is a dumpster fire is maybe a more accurate and less frou-frou way of putting it. But let's just go with TJ Finley. I think we know more about TJ Finley as LSU fans than probably these other quarterbacks in the SEC, but we know what you're getting with those players. Mike Wright or Ken Seals, whoever's at Vanderbilt, we know when we can hope and we can expect that Jayden Daniels will provide a higher level of play than TJ Finley, than Mike Wright or Ken Seals, or whatever Vanderbilt decides to go down, whatever route they choose for their starting quarterback. But I do wonder, I feel like there's this interesting tier of quarterbacks. And I would put Bryce Young kind of in an area of his own, which is frustrating to say and it's frustrating to hear. But we know what Bryce Young can do. We know that Bryce Young can compete for a national championship. Put him aside. I look at KJ Jefferson, who is very much so a running quarterback. He's a mobile quarterback. I look at Hendon Hooker and his skill set. And I cover Hendon Hooker in the Tennessee Vols for my job here in Nashville. So, I mean, you may be a little bit more familiar with Hendon Hooker than maybe your average LSU fan. But I'll break it down in layman's terms that Hendon Hooker's skill set reminds me very much so of a Desmond Ridder, of a Jayden Daniels, and that he's an incredibly mobile quarterback. He has a heck of an arm, but he's not always incredibly accurate. And that's exactly kind of the vibe that I've gotten about Jayden Daniels. Albeit he's very talented with his legs, albeit he's got a strong arm, sometimes the accuracy is an issue. I look at Will Rogers, another player who's been able to thrive in Mike Leach's offense. You know, if you put Will Rogers in another offensive scheme, I don't really know how well he would do it, but I also put Will Rogers in the category of very much so a passing quarterback, more so than a running and mobile quarterback. I mean, Will Rogers had almost 5,000 passing yards, had almost a 75% completion rate in 2021. I mean, he is a passing guy, which works in that Mike Leach spread offense. I look at Anthony Richardson. He's another quarterback that is incredibly mobile. However, I do think that Anthony Richardson is maybe a little bit too foot happy. And that was another concern of mine with Jayden Daniels. And that was something that I asked Richie Bradshaw, the host of Locked On Sun Devils. I said, what do you think he's best at? He said he's best on the run. He's got a strong arm, but he's more reliable on the ground. I look at Anthony Richardson and I look at Florida, and I do wonder, is Florida's offense going to be too one-dimensional? I take all of that information and I kind of worry. Does that mean that Jayden Daniels is maybe a little bit too one-dimensional? Does that mean that Jayden Daniels falls into more of a category with, let's say, Anthony Richardson than maybe more of the dual threats of KJ Jefferson and Hendon Hooker? It's a legitimate concern. And then I look at Stetson Bennett, which if Stetson Bennett didn't have the best defense in college football last year, he would not be a national championship winning quarterback. And I'll just leave it at that. I don't think there's anything that Stetson Bennett does that's overly exciting, that's overly talented. I think that he is what he is. He has a fairly low ceiling. He doesn't have a future in the NFL. And him winning a national championship is more of a unicorn than it is anything else. And then I also look at some quarterbacks that are also question marks in the SEC. Jackson Dart, a transfer into Ole Miss from USC. And I look at Spencer Rattler, a transfer into South Carolina, other USC, from Oklahoma. Now, I think just Spencer Rattler being such a big-time household name within college football and seeing his season last year, I pray and I hope to God that Jayden Daniels does not fall into the category with Spencer Rattler, because I think he is incredibly overrated. I think he is incredibly inaccurate. And I think that he has the worst attitude for somebody to be a leader on a team. So I'm hoping that he doesn't fall into that category. But I do think Jackson Dart will be very, very interesting, because he didn't start last year at USC. You know, he kind of tipped his feet in the water. He got a couple starts, but nothing to really, not a big enough sample size for me to say, okay, this is what Jackson Dart looks like. You know, this is the category that he falls into. But I think if you're looking at the SEC and if you're looking for a few answers of what is Jayden Daniels, what could this offense be with him, I look at KJ Jefferson, Hendon Hooker, and Anthony Richardson to be the three quarterbacks that he resembles most. And that's not to say that, oh God, you know, you may look at the Tennessee Vols and say, we know LSU doesn't want to be the Tennessee Volunteers. It's not necessarily that's going to be that exact offense. And it's not necessarily like that's going to be the outcome for LSU. But I look at the styles of those quarterbacks. I think that he may be a little bit more of an accurate passer with Hendon Hooker, but it is a concern, I think, for both Vol fans for Hendon Hooker and for in Arizona State fans watching Jayden Daniels throughout his time as a Sun Devil, that the accuracy is an issue, but the reliance on his legs, or I don't want to use the word reliance because I feel like that has a negative connotation, but the ability to defer to his legs is always a positive. So I kind of feel like there's this top tier of quarterbacks, and I'll put Bryce Young in that top tier, and other quarterbacks may work their way into it in the 2022 season. But I feel like there's this really solid tier of quarterbacks that might not be in the Heisman conversation, that might not be, you know, the top quarterbacks in all of college football. But if you look at the SEC, then they're really solid quarterbacks that can, you know, win games for their teams. And I look at KJ Jefferson, I look at Hendon Hooker, and I look at Anthony Richardson, and I feel like Jayden Daniels could fall into that tier. Now, I don't know for certain. This is all just speculation, just based off of what I've seen from those quarterbacks. And that's all speculation just based off of what we know of Jayden Daniels. And it's also from what I've heard from Arizona State is, you know, your expectations, you're going to get a solid quarterback, and you're going to get a solid leader, and you're going to get a guy who wants to compete. But he still has holes in his game. He's still not incredibly accurate, and sometimes the decision-making is questionable. So, is he elite? Not from what I've heard, but does he need to be? I think that's another question that we need to answer. Does he need to be elite? Because when I was on Locked On Sun Devils, they said that Jayden Daniels is the kind of quarterback that doesn't elevate the players around him, but it also won't bring the players around him down. Does Jayden Daniels have the perfect skill set and is just talented enough that he can complement all of the other offensive weapons on LSU? That's a question that I will continue to look into and a question that I'd like to get back to on tomorrow's podcast. But we'll get into that later on this week, later on in the season, once we learn more about our new friend, Jayden Daniels. But coming up next, it's a Mailbag Wednesday on a Thursday. I apologize for all of y'all who sent in your questions that I wasn't able to get to yesterday, but we had our friend Richie Bradshaw from Locked On Sun Devils, and we had such a great conversation that it fell into 2 segments. So we'll get to your questions on a Mailbag Wednesday/Thursday coming up next on Locked On LSU. But before we do that, remember that March Madness is just a few weeks away. So that means that you need to start thinking now about where you're going to be running your brackets this year. Are you going for the usual, or are you looking for the best? We've done our homework here at Locked On, and we are running our brackets with RunYourPool.com. Along with standard brackets, RunYourPool offers game types like Survivor or Pick X, and I like to switch things up a little bit because sometimes doing the same bracket every year gets boring, so switch things up a little bit. They also have options to edit scoring, and they offer more intel to make your picks, all stuff that you're not going to find at the usual places where you do your brackets. You're not going to find it at ESPN or CBS. RunYourPool is unique. And if you've got a business, RunYourPool can help you take some of that madness magic and play alongside your employees or even gain customers. Plus, they offer full white glove customer support, custom branding, one of the easiest 3-minute setups that you will ever find. Clearly, we at Locked On believe in RunYourPool because, like I said, we're running our brackets there ourselves. There is no truer test than that. If you want to play against us for a shot at a cash prize, join us at runyourpool.com/lockedon. And while you're there, create your own pool for your friends and family. Enter code PUREMADNESS at checkout for $10 off your custom pool. All the rules and details will be available there. That's runyourpool.com/lockedon for your chance to win a cash prize. We look forward to seeing and hopefully beating you there. It is that time of year again. College basketball tournament time is finally upon us. From all the latest odds, contests, and player props, BetOnline.net is the #1 source for all of your sports betting needs and information. BetOnline remains the best spot for all of your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sporting wagering information needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, it's a Thursday, but we're doing our Mailbag Wednesday on a Thursday because we're just keeping things light. We're keeping things fresh. We're switching things up today. So Mailbag Wednesday on a Thursday. First and foremost, we got a question coming in from Mike asking very blatantly, do you think LSU can win the SEC tournament? I think that the SEC tournament is an incredibly tricky thing because I feel like every year, almost every year, men's and women's SEC tournaments, who you think is going to win, and maybe even sometimes the best team doesn't win. I mean, I think that either South Carolina or Florida or LSU are the 3 best women's teams in the SEC. And none of those teams won the SEC tournament. It was a total shocker in Kentucky. Sometimes it's the teams that get hot at the right time. Sometimes it's the teams that just, fall the right way in the bracket and pull the right games and play the right style that they just make their way through the tournament and they're able to win it all. So yeah, I totally think LSU could win the SEC tournament. They've got a ton of talent. They've got one of the best defenses in SEC basketball. But I think the SEC tournament is especially interesting this year because this is the first time in a long time that the SEC is this competitive. I mean, you look at Arkansas, look at Auburn, you look at Kentucky, you look at Tennessee, you look at LSU. I mean, even look at what Vanderbilt did to Georgia. Now, I don't think Vanderbilt's going to make a run for the SEC tournament, but still, crazier things happen. I mean, the SEC is so top heavy. And I'll pick, Arkansas, Auburn, Kentucky, and even Tennessee in there as well. This is an incredibly top-heavy SEC, and it's going to be a tough road to eventually win the tournament. LSU needs a little bit more consistency if they want to make a run for it. LSU, it's going to be tough because they're going to be playing teams, that have the double bye. And LSU won't have fresh legs underneath them when they're playing Arkansas. And if they beat Arkansas going on further into the tournament, I think they could do it. I mean, why not? They've got a ton of talent. They've got a great defense. And when they play right, when they're able to sink shots, and when they're able to play their style of ball, when that full court press is working, they could beat anybody. And they've beat the better teams in the SEC. I mean, they've beaten Kentucky. They've beaten Tennessee. They almost beat Arkansas. Why not? They could do it. We've also got another question coming in from Rebecca. What is your level of concern for LSU baseball after they lost to Baylor in Texas? I really try not to get too high or too low with baseball, especially considering that this is an incredibly long season. So, but I also say that with a grain of salt because I came into the season thinking that LSU was going to be one of the best teams in the country. And I still believe that. They're still a ranked team and they still have a ton of talent. They still have the best recruiting class in baseball. And there's still so much time left to develop this team. There's still so much time left to kind of, dig themselves out of this metaphorical hole that they may have dug themselves in the first couple of weeks of the season. So much can change within a baseball season. I mean, you play 4 to 5 games a week. I mean, you're going to lose games. You're going to drop games. You can't get too high. You can't get too low, especially on March 9th. I mean, this is a league that goes in well into the summertime. So plenty of things can change. But what I did see in Houston wasn't incredibly motivating and wasn't great. I'll just say for the near future. Because like I said, I went into the season thinking LSU was going to be one of the best teams in the country. And one of the best teams in the country beats other good teams in the country, beats the other best teams in the country. I went into this series thinking they'd go 2-1, thinking that they would probably drop that game to Texas, but thinking that it would be a little bit more competitive than it was. That was a little bit of a red flag to me. I mean, LSU got their butt stomped, y'all, by Texas. Of course, they're the number 1 team in the country. They're going to beat most teams out there. I wish it would have been a little bit more competitive. I look at the Baylor game. That's a game that they should have won. That's a game they could have won if they just cleaned things up on defense. So at least there's something that you can kind of point to and say, that's the issue. That it's not just this fundamental issue within the roster, that it's not a bunch of holes in the bullpen, that it's not, they can't get the bats moving. I feel very confident in saying that the infield defense has been the issue for LSU in these recent games that they've dropped. So that's something they can work on. It's a skill thing. It's a technique thing. They can work on that. So my level of concern is low because it's early and so much can change. But taking that with a grain of salt and also, moving forward, like I need to see some changes. And if I do start to see changes, then that level could go down. If I don't, then it'll go up because there's nothing worse than seeing persistent issues and seeing the same mistakes happen over and over and over again. That's when I'll start to actually really be concerned. But that is going to do it for me today. We do a Mailbag Wednesday every week, usually on Wednesdays, just not this week. So if you have a question for me, whether it's football, basketball, baseball, women's basketball, gymnastics, anything about me, any questions that you may have about the podcast, I will take all of your questions. You can send them in on Twitter at CarolineFenton1 or at LockedOnLSU. I'll take as many as I possibly can. I apologize if I didn't get to yours this week. I always recycle them to the next week if they are still relevant. So apologies if I didn't get to them, but I will get to them as soon as possible. Thank you for making Locked on LSU your first listen every day. Coming up tomorrow, I will make my betting picks for the SEC tournament weekend, as well as recapping all of the action from LSU, Missouri. Now make your second listen Locked on NFL Draft. Ryan Tracy and former NFL cornerback Eric Crocker bring the NFL Draft to life every day with insight and analysis on college football prospects and NFL front offices. I will see y'all tomorrow, Tigers.